Welcome to A Line Through Time, where I take the time to look through your favourite franchises and work out how it all lines up. Prequels are probably the most difficult type of follow-up media to create and typically the least worth it. Don't get me wrong, there are some great prequels out there, sometimes even the best stories in their respective series. But there is so much going against the prequel that sequels don't have to worry about as much. Keep in mind that when I say prequel, I'm referring to all new stories set earlier in the timeline than the latest point, as a sequel with new backstory can be just as problematic in a number of the following areas. First, of course, is the impact on the story's stakes. No one watching the Star Wars prequels ever thought Obi-Wan, Anakin or Yoda were going to die because we knew from the original trilogy that they had to survive. New characters who have never been mentioned like Mace Windu, Jango Fett and Qui-Gon Jinn, while not guaranteed a death, were very likely to receive one to explain why they weren't around later in the timeline. This also causes incredibly forced, unrealistic and out of character actions to occur when the story progresses naturally but has to stop dead in its tracks because the natural progression would contradict previous continuity. For example, in the Injustice prequel comics, Wonder Woman accidentally kills another hero. Batwoman then proceeds to beat her savagely. Batwoman is pragmatic and willing to kill. Wonder Woman is allied with Space Hitler Superman and has just killed a close ally. Batwoman has the Amazon at her mercy and says, "You're not worth it." Realistically, Kate would have slit Diana's fucking throat, but since Diana has to survive into the game, this horribly contrived scenario plays out. Second is the seemingly inherent inability to keep things consistent. It's very rare for a prequel to not somehow contradict what came before. Sometimes these changes are for the best, like Virgil's expanded presence after Devil May Cry 3, or Metal Gear's Big Boss being made younger to allow for more playable appearances. Even without contradicting anything though, it can still raise all sorts of questions about the canon. For example, the addition of very significant events to the backstory that everyone knows about, but unanimously and individually decides not to mention until a very specific time years later. I'll let Hyperbit Hero explain this with an excerpt from his review of Yakuza 0.
One of my biggest problems with prequels is the tendency for writers to poorly imply greater things about the relationships between characters than was originally intended when the previous entries were written. Like Snake and Otacon weren't just allies, their fathers who look and sound exactly the same were allies too, and they went on to develop and fight multiple giant robots together.
Another example does exist in the Yakuza series, but to a less egregious degree. The hit of 85 is a major event in the Tokyo underworld that everyone in the game knows about, be they Yakuza, Cop or Loan Shark, yet no one brought it up before Yakuza 4 despite it being such a significant event with ramifications lasting to the present. Also, it just so happens to have been a major character's previously unmentioned sworn brother who did the hit. Technology and character abilities fall into this too. A character might learn a new skill or gain some new equipment which a point is made out of, but leaving it out of a new installment would feel like a step back, hence it then appearing in a prequel, like Batman having Arkham City gadgets in Arkham Origins, or how Dante can acquire moves in Devil May Cry 1 that he already knew years earlier in DMC 3. Likewise, Metal Gear's technological progression is totally skewed and messed up thanks to the series jumping all over the timeline. Hologram technology existed in 1975 but fell out of use about a decade later and didn't resurface until 2016 or so. Also, every Metal Gear unit that existed before the one from the first game is vastly more advanced, stretching back over 2 decades before it. But despite all the inconsistencies, prequels simultaneously have a tendency to tie things up too neatly, leaving the setting in a limbo state during the intervening years. The Star Wars prequels had that problem. Episode 3 ends with everything matching up with Episode 4, meaning nothing really happens in the 18 or so years between trilogies, which makes no sense when one considers that the second Death Star only takes a couple years to build while the first took about 10 times that. Prequels are also the most common cause of demystifying characters and events. We've all experienced a story that has a character or event that's discussed at length, but their actual role in the story is limited, leaving the majority of their presence as hearsay and myth. Big Boss, Sparda, The Boss, Zack Fair, Xehanort, Reach, the Keyblade War. It's fun to speculate and imagine what these characters are like as people, or what specifically went down during these events, as well as how that might be expanded upon or explored in a prequel. However, it rarely lives up to our expectations and can make the whole affair seem quite mundane or even too ridiculous. Sometimes it works, like with Big Boss and Zack. On the other hand, the machinations of Xehanort make absolutely no sense and the story becomes nigh impossible to follow. I've also seen a few instances where a prequel and a remake are made one after the other. Halo, Yakuza, Resident Evil. If you've seen the episode on game remakes, you know that remakes supplant the original version, so I have one piece of advice for all aspiring game devs. Do the prequel first. Why, you ask? If you do the remake first, it's almost guaranteed to be contradicted once the prequel comes out. If you make the prequel first, the remake can then integrate those new details and make the work as a whole much more cohesive. This is the biggest failing of the Resident Evil remake in my opinion. For how bloody fantastic it is as both a game and a remake, it was hampered by this in the broader context of the series. Right after remake, RE0 was released, expanding on Rebecca Chambers' backstory leading into remake. Her weak and inexperienced remake personality clashes heavily with everything she goes through in RE0, and you can't argue they didn't know they'd be making RE0 when they did remake. RE0 was in development for the N64 years before remake was conceived, so there was no excuse for not taking RE0 into account when developing remake. So Rebecca Chambers, who fights off tons of monsters including hunters and solos a tyrant, is suddenly shitting it over a single hunter. Like, really love? The ultimate question one needs to ask when making a prequel, especially if the story is an expansion of events the audience already knows the outcome of from prior installments, is this. Is this story worth telling? Is the new information the audience will gain from this story interesting enough to carry the entire rest of the product? Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII is a prequel to Final Fantasy VII, following a character players of the original already know died and even how he died. The new stuff with Sephiroth and Genesis was horrendous self-insert fanfiction for Gact, but Zack's story was good. It's about a man who, despite having everything going against him and losing everything he holds dear, is still able to hold on to his beliefs even in death. So, for the most part, yeah, it was worth it. Conversely, Dissidia Duodec in Final Fantasy is a prequel to the first Dissidia set in one of the previous cycles that we already knew the heroes lost, meaning it has to try and tell an interesting story to make the player feel like their time wasn't wasted. The story focuses on new characters and then has to be about explaining why they weren't in the original and tries really hard to make them important. But it all falls flatter than Lightning's personality and actively complicates and damages the original game's plot. Bad prequel. Devil May Cry 3 is a huge retcon, establishing Dante's brother Virgil still being around about a decade before the first game, which made it clear he was supposed to be presumed dead for 20 years. No one's complaining though, because DMC3 has the best plots in the series with a solid arc for Dante, Virgil is an awesome badass, and we get some decent explanations for why certain things are the way they are. And it also introduced Best Girl Lady, so good prequel. Halo Reach takes the series back to its roots with a story that leads directly into the original game. It fleshes out some details and manages to give the player a few objectives that make the adventure feel like a significant event in the Halo canon. The events going unmentioned afterwards, rather than being a problem, actually adds to the tragedy of it all, leaving the final message as, you and your actions won't be remembered, but know that you did make a difference. Good prequel. Every arc of the Injustice comics just introduces a new group of characters to fight Superman and lose solely to explain why they aren't around during the game. The comics don't tell an interesting story and instead serve as a checklist to answer the question, where is X? And that answer is almost always dead, usually with the addition of murdered by their friends. I believe the MKX comics do the same thing. Bad prequel. And don't fucking get me started on why Xehanort from Kingdom Hearts doesn't work. I hope through this whole thing that I've been able to showcase how difficult it really is to make a prequel work and perhaps give you a greater appreciation for the ones that do, while also getting you to look more critically at the ones that don't. I'm going to leave you now with a couple of closing thoughts. First, some trivia. When I first made the title card for this video, I somehow forgot to include Naked Snake. I remembered Noble Six, but not Big Boss. The fuck's wrong with me? Secondly, consider this. It's interesting how prequels can add a whole new level of context and expose deeper levels of a character for good or for ill. Like, remember how in 1999, when Solid Snake fights Big Boss, Master Miller's all, "Do it, Snake! Kill that monster!" And then we find out that 15 years earlier he was actively pushing for the murder of children. Good times.